introduce myself. My name is Elaine Chao. I'm a product manager on Adobe XD, and I've been focusing on the area of collaboration for the past 2 years. And it just so happens I'm also one of the original team members on Adobe XD. It's been quite a ride. And actually, a fun fact, I was the first woman on the team as well. So yeah, I don't know. It's funny, I always get applause for that. I don't know why. We have a lot of women on the team now, and it's a fantastic place to work. So I am really active on social media. I know I pointed this out earlier, but I also do a daily pro tip on Adobe XD. So if you're interested in learning more about the product, feel free to give me a follow. My DMs are also open. And so I really encourage conversation afterwards. And so if you are interested in having more of a conversation about collaboration or any kind of challenges that you're hitting, or if you just want to give me feedback, feel free to send me a DM. That's actually the best way to get hold of me, more actually than my own email. And so, because this actually is a side channel that I reserve specifically for people who are interested in XD. So when I was thinking, when I was tasked to think about this topic, it was really just about how designers work together. But really, the way that we think about collaboration within a design environment on Adobe XD is really about an ecosystem, right? Because there are a lot of different types of relationships that a designer has. And this thinking is fueled by a ton of engagement and research. Now, I, as a member of the product team, have the privilege of going out into the world. And we also have extensions of our product team in our business development organization. And between our group and the business development organization, we have traveled all over the world, literally thousands of organizations. We multiply that by however many conversations that we've had, and we've had a lot of conversations about how teams work. So this information has all gone in to inform XD's collaboration features and how we think about collaboration in general. So that brings us into this class, which is entitled How to Open Design Leads to Better Decisions and Products. But really, I think it should be Why Collaboration is Hard. Right? Because this is a really tough problem. Chances are you are here because you have hit some collaboration challenges. And it was kind of funny, I was looking at who signed up for the class. It doesn't give me names, it just gives me titles and organizations. And I was kind of surprised to find out that a lot of big name companies are represented here in this room. And there's also a lot of people who are in kind of management on up type of roles, not just individual contributors. So I was just trying to figure out why is it that this particular, segment of Macs would come and sign up for this class. And I came to the realization or the conclusion that it's not that the challenges don't exist on this individual contributor level, but they are more obvious and more painful the larger your scale. The larger your organization is, the more painful this whole thing of collaboration is. So what I hope to share in this class, in this next 55 minutes or so, is some of the learnings that we've had along the way, in talking with these organizations. But more than that, I wanted to pull in some academic research. I wanted to pull in research from the business world to help us inform how our organization should be run. And part of the reason I decided to do this was because, the academic world really takes an outside view on an entire system. And so this kind of unbiased view of organizations helps us to inform how we should better structure ourselves, right? And how we can harness these best practices for our own benefit. So I'm going to start out with a somewhat controversial statement, especially as someone whose entire job is making a collaboration tool, which is that collaboration is not about tools. All right. This talk isn't going to focus until Adobe XD until the very end. I'm going to talk about XD a little bit for about 5 minutes or so. And the reason is that collaboration is ultimately about people, right? It is a people problem. It is a human problem. And in our discussions around the world, with all these organizations, we discover that no matter what set of tools they use, they could be using Adobe tools, they could be using whatever else is out there, and there's a lot out there. The problems they are trying to solve are actually relatively universal. And ultimately, people are trying to solve the problem of self-organization and the process of decision making, both of which can be very, very difficult. So as any other design problem, because most of us are designers in here, in order to understand the solution, we kind of have to think about the problem first, right? So I wanted to start out with the fundamental reasons why people collaborate at all, right? Why do you bother? So I think especially from a large organization perspective, the concept of scaling is actually really important to think about, right? You start with one person. As your organization grows, as your demands and your throughput, as you're scaling up engineers or scaling your business, you just add more people, right? You're just oh, I'm just going to add more headcount to increase your throughput. And the problem is that, I think all of us know this, that scaling is nonlinear, right? There's a certain amount of overhead that comes with adding more people. And this overhead only increases the larger your organization gets. So you build infrastructure to keep your organization working and to keep your frontline teams small. And this comes from additional research as well, where they've identified the special number as less than 10. So in design work, the real reason to scale is to accelerate the amount of output. I talked a little bit about engineers and about this whole production process, but also what happens if you have more clients, right? If you're in an agency setting and you just want to add more clients because you want to build your business, hey, you want to accelerate your work. So these are valid reasons to scale. Now, as you're scaling, some of the things that you can do are parallelization, right? Oh, you're going to work on this work stream, this other person is going to work on another work stream, and they will never meet. They will never work on the same thing. So you can also dogpile, right? And we've talked to some organizations who do this. They are in such urgent, oh my goodness, we need to deliver this to the client, that they have 3 designers working on the same work stream. They have people working on different documents, bringing them back in, reserving a day so that all of that goes into one deliverable for the client. And yes, I recognize the irony of using a puddle of cats for a dog pile, but hey, thematic. But in design organizations, I think we all see that there are significant challenges the larger your organization gets. And one of them that we come across is this concept of visual consistency, right? And we've talked about this in the design world as solutions, right? We talk about design systems a lot. But really what you're trying to do is design consistency, right? So you have, for instance, in a single application or experience, you want that entire app or experience to be consistent. And if you're like Adobe, right, we have a whole family of applications, and I've lost count of how many exact apps we have, but as we have this family of applications, how do you keep that consistent across your entire brand? So you begin thinking about design patterns and brand identity and colors and character styles, relative spacing. All of this stuff goes into this whole thing of maintaining a consistent system. But it goes beyond that, right? Where we're beginning to get into things like communication patterns. We're talking about voice and tone, consistent lingo. How do you speak to your customer within your application? Is there a location where all of these messages come up? Do you have a toast on the bottom? Do you have a little pop-up on the top? Do you have maybe a little sidecar, a little column where all of your messages come in? So all of these things fit into the kinds of problems that happen once you scale. And so entire teams spin up to support these consistency goals. Yesterday we were talking about Spectrum, which is Adobe's design system, and we actually have an entire team that was built up to ensure design consistency across Adobe's products. So that's one thing. We were just talking about scaling. But the second thing that I want to dig into is the concept of inspiration. So sometimes magic happens in collaboration, right? Where it's not just one person. But really, when you have someone else who perceives the world slightly differently than you do, you start to be able to, have a little bit of give and take. And we have, this concept in the design world of diversity of thought, right, is really popular right now, where you're talking about gender diversity, cultural diversity, socioeconomic diversity, but also neurodiversity, right? But simply by providing a second set of eyes that is not the same person as the first set of eyes, right, you can ideate more deeply. So one such concept that I've been integrating a lot into my life recently is introduced through improv. Now, I'm not a great improv person, but I've taken some public speaking stuff, and this actually came up multiple times. One concept in improv, if you have been in improv itself, is called yes and. All right, so as you're building a scene, if I say, today we are in Los Angeles, and you say, no, actually today we're in New York, you don't have a scene at all, right? You just have a conflict. And you have people who have like different ideas of what reality is. But if I say, today we are in Los Angeles, and you say, yes, and we're at Adobe Max, we begin to have a story. We're building something together. So this brings us to a concept that's pair design. Last year I was introduced to a couple of designers who are interested in co-editing, which is the feature that was in beta, that was introduced yesterday in Adobe XD. And they were doing this thing called pair design, which is a concept they were introduced to at Pivotal Labs. And the way that they worked this out was that there was one physical machine, a hardware switch, 2 keyboards, 2 mice, 1 monitor. And one person would design, and the other person would actually actively watch. And so as a part of that, they would offer suggestions, they would offer solutions maybe, but they just could not, like their keyboard or mouse did nothing. And after that concept was finished, that artboard was finished, they would switch over into the other person. And then that person would take an artboard right next to it, and they would design for a little while and switch roles. So that first person would become the observer and the commentator. And this worked really well for their ideation. And it was just like fascinating to me as someone who was working on co-editing. So I'm just gonna let these quotes pass on by. This is from Penske, which is a big trucking company here in the US. And this actually gave them the opportunity to begin to ideate on a much deeper level. So that is the second thing that we're talking about, collaboration. But we on XD think about a broader sense of collaboration as well, because as you are making things, there are more people that you collaborate with. Great example of this are developers and clients, right? These are 2 people that you work very closer, 2 groups of people that you work very closely with in making a product or experience, right? You might have to hand something off. You might have to get something approved. And so as we were digging into like what people were looking at in terms of like feature requests or whatever, but really what the fundamental need was when they were dealing with these 2 different groups, it boiled down to 2 things. One of them was trust, right? They would say, we trust these groups, but we want to prevent accidents or misunderstandings, right? So there was something in there about that trust. Like, do we trust these groups of people? The second thing was context, right? We want to make sure that my client only sees what I give them access to, right? Do they really need to see all of my ideation work before I give them, something to sign off? Do my developers need to see all of my scratch work before I hand something off to them, right? Giving them the context of what they need to work on, or what they need to review, that was really important to people. Also, like whether or not, you wanted to comment, right? So the second one was control, right? Ensuring that people were focused on exactly what they need and given opportunities to only have access to what they needed. So an example of this was a subset of artboards, like, can you comment on this or not? I would like to control whether or not someone can comment on my presentation. Because if I'm making a presentation for my executive, I don't want my coworker to be able to comment on it and just like talk about some of the conflicts that we've been having, right? So there's this concept of context and control when sharing with fellow makers. So when I take a look at collaboration, this is kind of a summary of what we've just talked about. Like collaborations for, scaling. We talked a little bit about inspiration and that pair design. And then about the concept of context and control when working with fellow makers. So that brings us to, I think, the bulk of this conversation that we're having about collaboration, and that is the best practices, right? When I was looking at academic research, a lot of what I found was actually from business to business. But when I thought a little bit more deeply about it, this business-to-business model actually applies really deeply to design organizations. So what I'm going to do is go through 3 different articles. The first 2 are more business-to-business, and the last one's much more pragmatic for design organizations. So as design leaders, hopefully these are all really applicable to you and your teams. So Harvard business professor Gary Pisano and professor of leadership of technology Politecnico di Milano, big word, Roberto Verganti, presented the concept of collaboration architecture in their 2008 paper. By the way, as a side note, I'm planning to provide speaker notes without the cat photos, and so just expect an email if you've signed up for this class with something to download. And so in their 2008 paper, Professor Pisano and Professor Verganti talked a little bit about collaboration architecture as a concept. And I thought this was interesting because fundamentally, what it describes is this intentionality, right? You have to be intentional about setting the framework in which you collaborate. And that's because we know humans, in an organizational vacuum, people are just gonna make stuff up. And when you have multiple people making stuff up, that's when chaos happens, right? Humans want to make order out of chaos. And when people are trying to organize things, without a mutual understanding at the very beginning, you end up adding chaos to your own product cycle. It increases that overhead. So they described two different spectrums of ways that you can organize things. And I'm going to go through these and then show you a little chart at the end that helps you kind of visualize it a little bit more. So they described one spectrum is open versus closed. All right, so an open system is anyone can contribute at any time. All right, so an example of this is open source. Right? We talk about open systems, open source. Another type is where a community might choose popularity. So, for example, a vanity t-shirt press, right? Or like the type of jewelry presses that you can go and someone designs it and they put it up on the site and then other people can just buy it if they like the design. And also a little bit closer to home, I think, for those of us who are working in corporations, is maybe a design garage week, right? Where you all sit down and you just do whatever you want for 2 weeks to help us as a design organization and just open it up to anyone. And at the end, you evaluate which ones you actually want to integrate. So the key concept here is that you have to be able to evaluate the proposal really cheaply, and people have to be able to participate very cheaply. So those are the two things that you need to keep in mind with an open framework. But most of us are in closed environments, right? Most of us work for companies. And so you actually get to choose who you collaborate with because you hire them, right? And so they're within the doors of your corporation, they're insiders only, but you're making two implicit bets, right? So these two professors said that one thing is that you have made the bet that inside of your organization, you have the knowledge domain to be able to make the decision, and also that you have chosen the right collaborators. Okay, we spend a lot of time hiring, and we are very careful about that. That's a difference between open and closed, so that's an entire spectrum. So the other spectrum that we're talking about is hierarchical versus flat, right? And this is something that we are probably a lot more familiar with working at companies in any kind of organization, because this is a tension that we are very used to, right? We have the tension between hierarchical and flat organizations. So hierarchical is exactly what it sounds like. It's either an individual or an entity that has final say, right? Or has the authority to make a decision. So the fundamental assumption here is that person has enough context to be able to make that decision. Example, if you have a client, right, you have to kind of assume that if the client is the one that is accepting it, they have the business knowledge to be able to know whether or not something's applicable. So flat, on the other end, right, it means that the decisions are either decentralized or made jointly by collaborators. So in a business perspective, this is more like, we can share costs, we can share risks, the investment is shared among the organizations. But it works best when no single organization has enough resources to do it on their own. Maybe they don't have enough breadth of perspectives or capabilities. This is where this partnership really works out. So that brings us to this chart, right, that these two professors brought up. And the working model that you have, and basically the way that the organizations work together, or two designers work together, or two design organizations work together, are going to depend on where you are, right? Open or closed, hierarchical or flat. And when it comes down to it, it's like who makes the decisions and who is ultimately responsible. So they do point out, and I do want to give this caveat, that none of them are inherently better. And this is partially because, in the late 2000s, like open source is it's the be all and end all. It's going to be the best thing ever. But sometimes there are disadvantages to these types of open groups. For instance, you can make decisions a lot faster in a closed environment. Case in point, if you have 2 people, well, let's say you have 30 people going out to lunch, and you have 30 different opinions of where people want to go to lunch. How do you make that negotiation so that you finally go out to lunch before like 3 p.m., right? Versus maybe it's one person making a decision for all 30 people, or 2 people making a decision for all 30 people. These are like the trade-offs that you get, right? 30 people making a decision together, very painful. So another thing that you can that I'm going to point out is that if you're in a hierarchical structure, right, the elite circle versus like down here in the flat thing could describe operating models at different points of your organization, right? So, for example, maybe you have more of this consortium thing, this lower right-hand corner, if you have peers on the frontline level, right? So like your frontline designers are working together, collaborating very deeply on this like flat level, your peers, to provide some kind of outcome for your client, or maybe, outcome for a product manager or a VP of some kind, right? For approval and feedback. It could also describe models at different times in your design cycle. So for instance, maybe in ideation, right? In the early ideation phase, you're very flat. Everyone's ideas are equal. But maybe closer to the end of it, your product manager is going to make a decision, or like someone is going to make a decision about what is finally produced. So no matter where you are in the spectrum, the key point to remember here is setting clarity of expectations, right? Just making sure that those expectations are set. This is the phase that we're in. This is how we're operating as an organization. Let's do this together, right? So that's the first article that I was talking about. The second one is pretty interesting and addresses about whether or not collaboration is actually the solution, right? We talked a lot about the model. I have this repetitive. So this professor at both Berkeley and INSEAD, which is actually a management MBA kind of thing it's an international organization. So Professor Hansen had a pretty interesting article that was entitled, "When Internal Collaboration is Bad for Your Company." And this was on Harvard Business Review. So it was kind of a clickbaity article, right? Because I read this and I'm like, oh, when is it bad, right? And it really talked about it was like a brief case study on how a Norwegian risk management firm and the British beef industry was trying to collaborate on addressing the mad cow scare, right, in the mid-90s, and how that failed. And so Hansen came up with this formula, which I'm going to put up, to help you decide when to collaborate and when to just do it yourself, right? Again, this is context of business to business, but I think it applies to our design organizations as well. So he introduced the concept of a collaboration premium or collaboration penalty, that stuff on the bottom right there. Basically, net win or loss. Okay, and it's a very simple thing. I'm going to talk about all of these different lines right here. So the projected return is how much are you getting, right? How much are you getting from completing the project, or the cash from the project? And then opportunity cost is what is it going to cost you, right? In maybe parts or labor. And generally, people just stop right there. And they're just like, okay, that is ROI, right? I had to ask like 7 years ago what that stood for, but like return on investment, right? Here's my return on investment. Here's how much I get minus like the cost of that. But Hansen introduces one other line right here, which is the collaboration cost. And that is a cost you incur in working across organizational boundaries. So examples of this include maybe more travel, maybe more overhead for coordination, more meetings, negotiations over objectives. So it's both time and money, and an entire like organization spin up around this program management, project management to like handle these negotiations. I don't know about you guys, but I work, obviously at Adobe. We're an international company. Adobe XD is actually located in at least 5 different offices in 4 different time zones across 12 time zones, right? Like the worst that we have is probably 11.5 to 12.5 hours, depending on daylight savings time. So now, instead of ROI, we have this thing at the very bottom where it's like collaboration, premium, or penalty. And we now have a different kind of bar there, right? So it's not just like what you think is the cost, but this additional overhead. So one of the caveats that I want to give, especially like being as a person who works at a large company, is that sometimes there are intangible wins, right? Things that you can't necessarily put money on that might make this worth it, that might make like a penalty worth it. So an example of this is, hey, does this set you up for a future win by building relationships across teams? Or does it change the culture of a partner organization so that further engagements with them aren't as painful, right? So these are like non-tangible wins that can be very helpful for you down the line. So another thing to talk about is, does it give you downstream cost savings? Right? Because this is very like contained within a project. But one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is like the cost of design systems. And I know that this is a very hot topic right now in the design world, design systems. And the number one question that I get about design systems from people are like, so how do you get started? Like, my management will not give me the time or the resources to do what Adobe did, which is to spin up an entire team, right? Spectrum, like, I don't know how many people, 7 to 12 people or so. At Adobe who are focused on design systems. And there are people who come up to me and say like, hey, we are working at like 1,000 miles a minute. We have client deliverables and I don't have headcount for this. Like, how do you start? So this is really like what it comes down to. Are you going to have downstream cost savings? So while this model right here, this formula, doesn't hold up completely, it's a fascinating thing to think about. You know, fascinating trade-offs to think about, especially when you're thinking long-term. And hopefully this will help you decide whether or not to invest in collaboration. So that is the second article. And that brings me, I think, to the third article, which is a very recent article. The last two were like written a decade ago. This one was written this month. All right, it was released this month, also in the Harvard Business Review. And this was a professor at Harvard, Francesca Gino. And the article is called Cracking the Code of Sustained Collaboration. Again, I will write all of this out and you will have access, not necessarily access to the periodical, but at least know where it is. Now, this article really describes the attitudes of successful collaboration and dug into the ways that creative collaborators work together, which I thought was very applicable to design organizations, right? They really focused on Pixar as one of the organizations that works on creative collaboration. You know, as you guys know, like Pixar is a very successful film studio with Disney. And the key concept that she highlights at the very beginning is that all 6 of these attitudes can be taught and inculcated into your design organization. So I'm just going to go over these 6. It's going to take a little while, but I think these will be very useful because you can begin to bring this into your design organizations. So the first concept is listening and not talking, right? So Professor Gino broke this down into some additional concepts, which I'm going to just breeze through. One of them was asking expansive questions, like an open-ended like what or how question, which prompts people to give a little bit more information. Also, like it helps them to feel heard. And reflect on their situations. So instead of like problem solving, because I think a lot of us are, oh, hey, you know, I have this problem. And you're like, oh, well, you know, this is how you fix it, A, B, C, and D, right? You go directly into this problem solving mode instead of helping the other person to be able to maybe come up with their own solution, which might not be the same as yours. And that begins to have like a conversation, right? So for instance, hey, can you talk me through what happens if a user does X? And this is something that I've personally used in design reviews and design crits, just to like help them to further think about some of these edge cases that they might not have considered about. So the second was focusing on the speaker, not yourself, because it's very easy to be like, oh, hey, I have this problem. And you're like, oh yeah, well, I have this problem too. And like, oh man, I felt so awful about this. And you just keep on rambling and it makes it all about yourself and not about the other person who might want to kind of just like process a little bit, right? So the third one was, okay, you've been through this whole like I'm reflecting on that person, et cetera, but helping to teach people how to engage in self-checks, right? If you have a poor habit in communication, to be able to stop and say, oh wait, I did that wrong, right? And then to reframe things or maybe restate things, or just practice self-reflection, like, am I improving? Am I getting better on this? In terms of like being intentional about changing to more of a listener and less of a talker. And the fourth one, which I think, at least I'm guilty of this a lot, is just like, can you be comfortable with silence? And teaching that silence is okay, right? Because some people, like myself, I like to process a little bit before I say something, right? And so how do you encourage that internal processing as well? And so like teaching an organization to be okay with silence. Those of us who are nervous talkers will probably try to fill that silence with whatever is on our heads and dominate a conversation. So that's the first thing. The second one is teaching how empathy works within the design organization or within a creative context, right? So it frames every statement that your collaborator is talking with you under this thought, that every person involved has good intent, is intelligent, and is fully invested. Now, speaking as someone who collaborates across geos, across organizations, and actually outside of XD, I will fully confess that at times I have thought the opposite of one of these about one of my partners, right? You're just like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you suggested that. Like, what a dumb idea. Or like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you suggested that. Like, are you even on my side, right? So those are the things that cross my mind when I'm frustrated and I don't hold these three things in my head. So once again, every person has good intent, every person is intelligent, and every person is fully invested in a solution. So this one, a second practice that she suggests in this whole area is being able to reframe without adding your own opinion to it, right? And so teaching the skill of summarizing what someone is saying without, skewing it in any way. And so this opens up an opportunity for the other person to begin sharing more in depth about their own thinking. Another practice is trying to clarify the speaker's state of mind. So if someone is sharing something and they sound a little bit hesitant, you could say, hey, I noticed that you might be a little bit hesitant about the statement. Can you point out some of the pros and cons? Like, help me to explore your thinking. And this actually begins to surface some of that maybe internal conflict that they might be having and help them to express a little bit more so you understand where they're coming from. And hold on to that thought because it's going to be important later. So the third element in her recommendations is getting people comfortable with feedback. And all of us have been in design crits. And for those of you who have been in art school, I hear that it's particularly brutal, where people are like, you have design professors who are just telling you that your stuff is crap, right? But we in our design organizations can have more healthy patterns of behavior, right? And so this is a big part of it, getting people comfortable with feedback. And so I know that I'm also one of these people, right? Where it's like people can often feel that feedback is attacking, maybe confrontational, right? She gives a lot of suggestions here. I'm only going to do like 3 of them. One of them is to talk very frankly about this feedback avoidance. And I will fully say I'm avoidant personality. So feedback avoidance is a thing, and just recognizing that it is a thing and talking about like how we might be able to frame feedback, whether it's in a design crit or even as like a management type of situation where you're managing someone and helping them to be more successful. We as people who give feedback, as well as receive feedback, we have this like tension in here, right? Because we want to improve, but at the same time, we want to be like accepted for who we are. So how does feedback fit within this whole thing? So the way that we give feedback is important in this process, right? And so she describes how do you give feedback. For those of you who have been through management practice or management training, this is probably very familiar. It's give feedback that's direct, it's specific, and it's actionable, right? And the reason she mentions this is that apparently in the world, a lot of feedback that is given is very general, right? It's just like, oh, well, you should just give better presentations. Well, how, right? And so as someone who might be an individual contributor, you're just like, I don't know, like you say it looks sketchy. Like what about it? How do I fix sketchy, right? And so being able to give very direct feedback about those types of things helps an individual to grow, but it also helps your collaboration, right? Because it no longer becomes about like, your thinking is weird, and more about like, hey, you know, I've noticed that our user research has pointed out that this call to action should be at the top. You know, maybe we should bring it on the bottom, or giving feedback like that. So another possibility that she surfaces is giving feedback on feedback, right? And I think I have definitely received feedback and criticism that I have not been able to handle very well, especially from a creative side. And when it came down to it, like years later, I was able to boil it down to, you know what, that was not stated in a way that I could handle it. But I have also received feedback from people who are very, very good at giving feedback that helped me feel like they were on my side and that they had my best interests in mind. And so in talking to someone who gives me feedback, I can tell them that and say like, hey, right now, like it's not framed in a way that I can really handle. Like I want to feel that you're on my side and like what kinds of things can I do to improve? So this is a frank conversation that you can have as someone who's receiving feedback about what ways you can actually receive feedback best and be able to action on it. So this next one, teaching people to lead and follow, I found was fascinating. The example that she gave was about the Thai soccer team that was like trapped in the cave last year. I don't know if you guys remember this particular one. She brought in a description of what happened. I'm gonna read out like the list of people that were involved. Hydraulic engineers, geologists, divers, SEAL teams, NASA experts, doctors, and local politicians, and how they all came together to rescue the soccer team. And what I found really fascinating was that they were only successful because each one of them was only able to flex between leading and following. No one group out of that I read out right there was fully in charge. And in fact, this meant that they were open to ideas from maybe more like non-standard people, right? So there was an inexperienced engineer who suggested a path that led to a solution that kept the kids alive by diverting rainwater. And it was because this inexperienced engineer didn't know any better. He was just like, why don't we do this? They're like, oh, that might actually work. And it did. So teaching people how to lead and follow, teaching people to lead in their expertise, but also to follow in their areas of inexpertise, to be able to grow, but also so that the projects can succeed. So that brings us about the fifth one, speaking with clarity and avoiding abstractions. I think this was very linked to what I was talking about before when it was just like, give direct and actionable feedback, right? If you create a culture in which this is like the way that you communicate becomes much less personal. I find that when I'm giving feedback to like my fellow PMs or designers, developers, et cetera, if it becomes more specifically about the problem that we have to solve together, it changes the tenor of the conversation. All of a sudden, we are on the same side, right? And that's because I'm speaking with clarity and avoiding this like, well, this stinks, right? Man, like I can't believe this is poor quality. I can't believe that, like what happened here? Those are generalizations. But if I can point to something very specific, where it's just like, hey, we're getting a lot of these errors, these specific type of errors. Can we talk about a way that we can address this, right? That becomes like a problem that we can all dogpile on. So that brings us to the sixth point, right? And I think this is the most important point, which is, and actually they're all fully interrelated, right? What you want to do is to train people to have win-win conversations. Because, it's not I don't know if you guys have read Deborah Tannen's work. She's a social linguist. I'm totally like deviating from a script right now. But like, she talks about one up, one down conversations where it's like, in order for me to win, I'm going to push you down, right? Instead of conversations that say like, hey, we have something to do together. I remember one of my early career conversations where we had hit a point where our project team was in really, really big trouble. And our product manager sat down and said, okay, what are we going to do to solve this? And afterwards, our project manager was like, you know what, I really respected what he did. And what he did was just very subtly said, what are we going to do to solve this? And just by framing it that way, we all of a sudden aligned from people who were all trying to kill each other to people who are all trying to solve the same problem together. And so I think in having win-win conversations, another thing that she mentions is like, have we fully explored what everyone wants out of this interaction, right? Do we know what the other person wants in this maybe tense negotiation? She gave this really interesting study that someone had done about two people negotiating over an orange. And one person had the goal of like getting the orange rind or like the zest, and the other person needed the juice from the orange, right? But you couldn't say what your eventual goal was. You just came in and you had an orange between the two of you. And so it was studying kind of the role of negotiation in here. And the people who were the most successful were the ones who actually talked about what their fundamental goal was. So you found it's like, oh, well, first I can juice the orange and then I can get the zest so we can both win. As opposed to, well, like maybe we divide the orange and so everyone kind of gets it. It sounds like it's even, but no one really wins, right? So training people to have these win-win conversations is another part of collaboration. So I'm just going to put this up so that you can take a photo. Again, I will post this out to you, but I know that, summarizing all of that in one slide was important. I do want to emphasize that all 6 of these attitudes can be taught, and all 6 of these attitudes can be included in your design organizations. And all 6 of these attitudes can be worked on, and it's not something that people will adopt immediately. It's something that you will need to grow into. All right, are we good? Can I move? Good, okay. So we've talked about these 3 main concepts when it comes to best practices, right? And so that leads me to my last little segment, which is where does technology fit in? And as a member of the Adobe XD team, especially, specifically focusing on collaboration, we've done a lot of thinking about these original problems that we identified and how we as technology help this process along. So let's talk a little bit about scaling. All right, so we've talked about the process that design organizations have scaled because we have more deliverables, et cetera, but we have problems with that. So one of them is design systems. So we've been investing in design systems on Adobe XD. We started out by being able to copy components from one document to another. Now we have linked assets where you can actually bring an entire asset panel, all of your colors, character styles, et cetera, into and your components into another document and have one source of truth for that. This is just the beginning of our design systems roadmap. And I do want to say that what we have right now is not what we're going to end up with. We do have monthly releases. This is something that we're investing very deeply in. So the second thing that we were talking about was this concept of ideation and dogpiling and parallelization, how do people work together? And as I mentioned earlier, we've introduced a new beta of co-editing, where 2 people or more can be working on the document at the same time. So you can imagine that in a world, maybe even a remote world, you could be doing the same pair design that Penske was doing. Or in a world where you have to dogpile on something, you don't have to reserve that last day to integrate 5 different files into one final deliverable. You can actually just be working on this maybe around the clock, right? If you have distributed teams to be able to deliver something at the very end. So just as one technology, I think, opens up a whole lot of ways of working. So when we talk about context and control, we're talking about developers and stakeholders, product managers, those types of roles. We have a couple of areas as well. One of them is called design specs. And design specs, which is in the new Share tab under Share for Development, gives you a view into all of your screens, so you can do all of your interactive prototyping so that the developer understands okay, this is how things move from one place to another. but also to be able to get colors, character styles, measurements in a format that they understand, that they can copy directly from, and they don't have to wade through like 50 different screens just to get the 5 that they really need for that particular feature, right? So this is very powerful. We also have these shared prototypes, which is also share for review, and under the share menu, the new share mode. And there are lots of different options in here because there are lots of different ways that people want to share for review. Some of them they want comments on. Some of them, you might want hotspots on or off if you're doing like testing. So these are all different configurable controls. We have some presets in there, and then you can use custom to be able to configure exactly what you want, password, invite only, those types of things. But this is a continuing conversation, right? This is not where we're ending. As if you're using Adobe XD right now, you know that we release every month. And we are constantly in the community talking with people, trying to figure out like what the problems are that we want to solve. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the relationship between technology and process, right? Because we've noticed as an industry, right, things like Slack and video conference have really transformed the way that we work. But also, they were originally built because of a problem. And so there's this whole thing of just like, there's an ecosystem, I think. There's like this cycle of tools informing the way that we work, and the way that we work informing the way that the tools work. And so it's kind of like this push and pull, which is why we need to continue in talking with people. So part of the way that we do this is in conversations with you, and we've visited all over the place. We have community events. We talk with people on social media all the time. My DMs, as I mentioned, is open. All the way up to our senior director of product management. We have both of them on social media, listening to people, like reading people's tweets. I'm thinking like between our product management team, we cover every single tweet that has the word Adobe XD in it. But we also have a system called User Voice. So if you haven't heard of User Voice is a way that as a system that we've put together to take user feedback, feature feedback, whether it's on something that we've already released or like something that you really wish were in the product, go ahead and stick it in User Voice. My only caveat, because I'm one of those people who looks at User Voice all the time, is to please insert one feature per ticket. Because sometimes we get these things where it's like, here is an entire essay with 20 different feature requests. I'm like, I don't know what to do with it, right? Because part of the power of User Voice is being able to combine them together so that we can get a sense of what the design industry is looking for. So that brings us to a point where we're about 20 minutes out. I do want to mention, survey, please fill that out. It actually helps me as a speaker as well as Adobe as a whole to be able to manage content that in future maxes. So your feedback is really important. Again, not only for me, but also for future content. I did mention I will email out. So if you have actually signed up to be as a part of this class as opposed to walking in, you should get an email from me, I'm hoping tomorrow, with something for you to download. Of course, I downloaded all of these cat photos off of the internet, and so like I can't put them in something that I can send out to you, but all the content should be available in these downloadable notes. And once again, my DMs are open. Please contact me, which leads us to the last 20 minutes. I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask questions of me or maybe surface anything that kind of sparked as a part of this class. Do we have a mic in the room? Or should I just repeat? I'll just repeat questions. All right. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
One of the challenges that I've had with our teams is naming conventions and just getting everyone on the same page with what we name files, layers, styles, all the way down, And I'm just wondering if that's something, because that's obviously a big impact on collaboration and could really solve a lot of problems if there was some standardization around it. I've had a really hard time coming up with like the solution to that. Is there any direction that you can provide along those lines, or somewhere that maybe you could send me to?
Yeah.
I look that kind of stuff up all the time, and people have different ways of doing it, but I haven't really landed on
Yeah, so the question has to do with naming conventions and saving document conventions, so basically ways of working together, because these are types of things that, like, if you're working quickly, like no one names their layers, but naming layers is one of those things that helps to communicate what the purpose of an object is, right? And so the question was, in this kind of ecosystem where no one can agree, like, what's a best practice? And my answer for you is, like, I don't have one. Part of the reason I say that is because naming conventions, like many other things, are very personal. And they are very specific to the lingo of a particular organization. So I think that ultimately it is something that a team has to come together and agree upon. And I also know that, you know, designers are particular, and they're just like, well, I don't think that way, right? And so the question is, can you find something that people can conform to? Or if not, like, how do you deal with it? And I think that those are challenges that I think every design organization has, right? If you're working on the same thing, how do you make sure that that same thing is, you know, tenable? So yeah. Sorry, I don't have a good answer. All right. Any other questions? I have people's. Yeah, over here in front.
So when it's easy to get stuck into a mode of when you're working on a project or whatever it might be, to get into a situation where you feel like there are sides, as you spoke of, right? Like who's defining those sides? From a perspective of even like from Adobe, how do you? Obviously, your goals are based on potentially client, then internally what our goals are, and so how do you, I mean, even in Adobe, how do you prioritize those so that everybody starts to see those lines blur so that there aren't sides because everybody's aiming at a goal, right? So some from a user experience perspective or from a designer perspective or project management or even for their leadership, everybody kind of seems to have goals, but how do you internally align those goals when you're working on something like XD?
Yeah, so the question, I'm going to repeat this for the recording, has to do with how do you align goals from different people with different opinions, maybe even from different roles, and how do we handle this at Adobe? Is that a good summary? Yeah. Okay. And this is something that I feel is kind of an art, right? In terms of, I will say that on Adobe XD, I don't think we have as much conflict about that, because we as an organization are very user-centered. And so when you pivot to focus on the customer, you begin to have a very different perspective about things, right? The arguments that you have are very, very different. It's not like, oh, I think this is better. It's more of a, okay, you know, if we think this is better for the customer, can we get more data to ensure that this is better for the customer? Or if it's like, we got to do this way because, like, we've run out of time and we just need to implement something, right? Those are different forcing functions. One of the things that we do is to focus a lot on data, and whether that is hard data that we get or it's experiential data that we get through research. We also have a research arm of our design organization that goes ahead, and one of our primary researchers that we work with most closely is a PhD in anthropology. And so for her, it's a lot more like, okay, let's look at this systemically, let's look at it culturally, and what are the problems that you're truly trying to solve? And so once you've aligned on those, I think the conversation shifts a little bit, right? Definitely because we work on software, there's always a push-pull, right? There's a, hey, this is optimal, and then like, hey, this is what we can accomplish. And so, you know, knowing what we do, we're also a very PM and design-led organization, and so that becomes a negotiation as well. So let me give a caveat on that. We are a PM, design, and engineering. We often work as a triad. And so those conversations happen, I think, on a smaller scale. Yeah, I think hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, it just kind of reframes it a little bit, right? And it takes a lot of the ego and personality out of it, because the more that everyone understands the problem and the more that everyone understands the user's need, it puts a more focus on the actual problem. Yeah, so talking, just to summarize, just like it changes the conversation when you all have the same like rough goal. One thing that was surfaced a couple of days ago in our UX Leader Summit, I asked a question: how many people have engineers along on usability studies? And because we were talking about some of the conflicts that people are having with engineering and development organizations. And that was something that, like, it's something that we do on XD. I don't know if you've been to our booth, but we actually have a lot of engineers and developers at our booth in the community pavilion. And that's partially to give us that experience, right? When I was, my background's actually as a developer, and I worked on XD as a developer for 2 years. I remember when we had Repeat Grid, and we have a usability lab in San Francisco. And we had like 3 of us developers in the back, and like someone was using Repeat Grid and like just trying to figure it out. And we it's not fully soundproof, it's only partially soundproof. And so we're like, and so when, developers, not only designers and product managers, but when developers have that visceral sense of like, we want the customer to succeed, something isn't working, we need to solve this together. It like changes that entire conversation because they've had that experience. And because they have this like pride in their work. Okay, in the middle here.
So I think one thing that I found kind of interesting is the correlation between collaboration and chefs in the kitchen, right? And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about like what is an effective number of people to bring in on the collaboration team, or is there a point where you should say, I know you're valuable and I want you here, but we can't have too many people, or is it just everyone come, let's all talk, let's all collaborate? I'm kind of curious if there's any thoughts or outcomes.
Yeah, so the conversation has to do with how many people is too many people in collaboration. The study that I read that was probably the most influential to me, there are actually 2 different things. One of them was a study that I read that said that over 10 people, you start to get loafers. You start to get people who just kind of like hang on to everyone else. And so you start getting like dominating, like people who are dominating the conversation, people who are really quiet. So that's like one thing to note. The second thing is that in the Agile training that I've had before, that special number is even lower. It's like 7 to 8, right? Where it's like, okay, when you get larger than that, then you begin to have controlled chaos, right? I have found that we've definitely broken the 7 to 8 per squad model at Adobe. And sometimes it's worked and sometimes it hasn't. On Adobe XD product management, we actually, at our last offsite, we had like 20 people in the room and not everyone was there, right? And so how does that begin to break up? We've actually broken our product management team and thus our engineering teams in some way, right? To align around themes. And so those themes kind of like work together and then we come together as a larger group to share ideas and to like give feedback, et cetera. But ultimately a smaller group is driving each initiative. And those are less than 7. The groups are less than 7. So I would recommend, just based on the research and the teaching and just like practical experience, once you get past about 7 to 10, you start like, the group dynamic starts fracturing a little bit. My magic number in a lot of group discussions has been 8. So if you get more than 8 people, if you get less than 8 people, then everyone has an opportunity and feels safe enough to talk, especially those who might be a little bit more hesitant to speak. And you can invite them, like make space for them in a group of like, less than 8. If you get to like 15 in a room, then you definitely have one person lecturing to another or like 3 people having a conversation over others, unless you're very intentional about it. Okay, in the back there.
When it comes to the six attitude of self-collaborator you mentioned, when it comes to like on-premise teams versus remote teams, what attitude you put on the back so you put more emphasis on?
That's a really good question. The question is on the 6, and I'm just going to back up over here and into these 6 over here. Which do I feel are more important for remote teams versus co-located teams? You know, when I was looking at this article, one of the things that was emphasized was that all 6 of them are interrelated. And there's no one thing that is more important than the other. It's just like, these are 6 characteristics of teams that work very well together. I find in remote teams, because we do have certain teams, and one of my teams is very remote. Actually, both of my teams are fairly remote. And spread between like people who are local and remote. That relationship is really important, and relationship is really key to the way that we work together. And so as I'm thinking about like, what is it about these 6 things that is important? And fundamentally, I think it's recognizing that people are actual humans, and that the conversations and the problems that we're solving together are made more special because they are other humans with different perspectives and different capabilities, complementary capabilities. And so coming in with a sense of humility and a sense of really like a hunger to, for everyone to contribute to the best of their ability, and recognizing that we've built this team to be complementary, right, is most important. I think it's less about time zone and location. Sometimes culture does play a part in it. We try to have an in-person meeting among our team at least like twice a year, sometimes once a quarter. I have 2 developers who are based out of Texas who will come in twice a year. And that FaceTime, you know, just sharing a meal together, having a casual conversation goes a really long way in humanizing the other person so that they're not just a head, right, on a video conference. But then you can begin to have real conversations, right, and begin to really solve problems together. So I know that was like a non-answer to your question. Hopefully it's more of like a guideline of where I see, you know, these 6 things, these attitudes, really having the foundation of relationship. Okay, in the back here.
Actually, I have a similar question to the question about the group discussion, but with regards to design reviews, do you limit the scope of those further? Like, how do you keep design reviews focused on actionable feedback on a specific feature, and not let it evolve into a general, I like this, I don't like this discussion?
Yeah, so the question has to do with design feedback and how do you make it actionable, especially in the context of like too many cooks in the kitchen. And we actually hit this as well because we almost have a one-to-one relationship between product managers and designers, which means that we have a whole lot of designers working on XD at the same time. The way that we handle it is that we have design crits that are much more based on those smaller pods that I was talking about, the smaller initiatives. And so you have a group of 5 designers who are coming together and actually like revving on things, coming up with ideas, you know, like giving feedback. And then the feature owner that the person, that the designer is working with generally weighs in as well. And so there's like a one-on-one presentation where that feature owner has an opportunity to give feedback that is much more actionable based on what they know about the industry, et cetera. And then once it's in a more final situation, that's, I'd say it's less crit and more socialization with a larger design, the larger design and PM organization. So those tend to be like weekly and it's more of a sign-off kind of thing. It's generally been socialized beforehand. But I think it tends to control some of these, the chaos that happens when you have like a lot of people in the room. It also helps that we're not a completely flat organization, right? Sometimes that hierarchy works for us, where it's like, okay, you know, has it made it out of your smaller design organization, your design pod in some way, right? So that we're all comfortable with it. Now, when we surface it to, you know, some of our senior directors, maybe the feedback that they have is much more directional, if that makes sense, and much less about like specific like interactions. It also helps in general that we have a very well understood design system and design paradigms, interaction paradigms. And so a lot of our conversations have to do more with workflow and less about specific interactions. Okay, I have 2 minutes left, so I have one more question. Yes, actually, how about in the front? Yeah.
So I'm a design educator, and I was curious to know what your thoughts were on the role the academic environment plays in preparing students for these collaborative environments, and whether or not it's advisable to try to simulate some elements, such as assigning roles and having them represent certain features or certain aspects of a project, or allowing them to kind of duke it out as they normally do.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and it has to do with design education and what would work best in terms of preparing designers, and maybe like after the class out in the hallway, like those of you who have opinions can go and speak to our design educator in the room and give your opinions. I think it's a both and. Right, and I having like my background primarily as a developer before product management, but working with designers all the time, is that the experience of working in a group in kind of like that parallel perspective, everyone's a peer, is important for learning just like social skills, right, and learning how to negotiate through some of the things that we're talking about over here, right? Like leading and following, like do you have win-win interactions? Like these are the types of things that I think work very well in these like peer environments. But I do also know that in certain university programs that I'm familiar with, they have specific classes that are more like, let's build you like a startup, right? Where you have someone from a business major and someone from a design major and a couple of engineers coming together to pitch a problem together. And then your roles are very well defined, right? And so you have someone who is practicing the project management and the product management. You have someone who is, you have people who are working together to like actually make this into reality. You have someone who is testing. And so, these types of classes, I think, are really important to kind of work out how these different roles work together in a very structured environment. But I don't think anyone should be exclusive, right? Because I think we've all been in situations where you've had to flex, right? We were talking about leading and following. People who are most successful are able to flex from leader to follower. And so, having that opportunity to practice those skills in different capacities, I think is important. So with that, we're gonna finish. I will be here for another 5 minutes and then out in the hallway because I get kicked out for the next class. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. Don't forget to fill out the survey. Thank you.